Hi everyone. Welcome to the Concepts from the Global South podcast. Here we explore the connections between the past and the present of non-European societies with the help of antique, classical, modern, emic, and ethic concepts. My name is Alisa Shablovskaya, and I am postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oslo in Iranian Studies. Today in our studio we have Sami Al-Daghistani, associate professor at Lund University, and he specializes in the study of the Islamic economic thought. He is the author of Ethical Teachings of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, Economics of Happiness, and The Making of Islamic Economic Thought, Islamization Law, and Moral Discourses. He is also the editor of the groundbreaking collective volume Recovering Environmental and Economic Traditions in the Islamic World. Sami has extensively written on Islamic moral economy, and today we're going to talk about one of its key principles, which is zakat, a mandatory form of charity, or not, in Islam, which is considered one of the 5 pillars of Islam. First of all, I want to say, Sami, we're so happy to have you here. I've been a fan of your work for a long time, and I really wanted to know, is it true that zakat can be qualified as charity? So it is often compared to Christian charity, but is it really the same? So could you elaborate a bit more about the etymology and the semantic field of zakat during the Prophet's time, and discuss how this early understanding shaped subsequent developments in the Islamic discourse on zakat?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me in the studio. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk to you about this important topic. When it comes to the very notion of zakat, as you rightly pointed out, it is regarded as one of the 5 pillars of Islam. That's very important to note. Zakat is mentioned in the Quran several times. It's also mentioned and more detailedly stipulated in the Hadith literature, so the literature of the Prophet Muhammad. Um, However, even though there are some similarities between the quote unquote the Islamic version of zakat and, let's say, how charity is introduced in other faith or religious traditions, there are also some major differences. Number one, it would be incorrect, I think, to translate zakat as charity, not just because it is, as already mentioned, a pillar of Islam, but it's also as quote unquote an obligation. Now, what that exactly stipulates or means obviously has several definitions or several approaches to describe it. If we think of zakat as alms tax and not necessarily charity, because charity is usually translated in Arabic as sadaqah, right? Sadaqah as charity would mean that it's completely voluntarily given, right? It's based on your free will, so to speak, to give it or not, and you add certain benefit if you give charity to a particular community or person or group of people. On the other hand, zakat as a pillar of Islam is detailed in a different way, right? Is accounted for in a different way. One could say that indeed it is expected that one gives zakat, being a pillar of Islam, in addition to other 4 pillars, namely the proclamation, right, that there is God and only God, as well as salat or prayer, which is also very important. And is, as a matter of fact, zakat appears in tandem, is mentioned in tandem with salat in Quran multiple times, right? And I'm going to come to that in a few moments. And then, moreover, there is Hajj, and as well as Saum or fasting. So Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, and then fasting as the 5th pillar. Now, when it comes to the stipulation of giving zakat as well, there is a slight difference, etymologically speaking, but also practically speaking, with charity. If one is invited to give or expected to give zakat as a alms tax, that means that you can give it only if you're also able-bodied to do so, right? There are certain stipulations describing, and this is really more in the Hadith literature, not in the Quran, as sort of the foundational text of Islam, describing how one gives zakat, in what capacity one gives zakat, under what circumstances as well. The Quran only explains to whom zakat should be given. So these are those who are obviously in need of some type of financial support or economic support, those who are obviously poor, those whose hearts have to be reconciled, those who've accepted or reverted to Islam, and those who have been freed as slaves as well, right? Now, other than that, there is no clear indication beyond this description. This is where I think the hadith literature, but also other classical sources come into play, namely that if one is financially secure to give zakat, then it's expected from that person to provide, right? Second, you have to be of mature person, so not a minor. You have to also be sane, right? Sound-minded, so to speak. All of these stipulations are indicated in various sources. When it comes to the amount itself, it is usually believed that zakat is given in a form of 2.5% of one's wealth, and that would be based on an annual income. Now we can we can discuss what quote unquote an income meant back in the classical or early Islamic period. And that would pretty much include also one's wealth, right? Not only income, but also property and other probably assets as well. If zakat had been institutionalized to the level that we perceive, a religious obligation or religious pillar to be institutionalized in our sort of modern context, then one might think that, well, it could have actually eradicated poverty, right? However, we know also from various sources, both Islamic and non-Islamic, that, well, zakat was not institutionalized to that level in the pre-modern period, and it's neither today in the modern contemporary period. This further indicates that there was some type of inequality in pre-modern societies as well, even in wealthy periods of Islam, right? Whether we're talking about the Umayyad Caliphate or the Abbasid Caliphate and beyond. Meaning zakat was not there really to clearly eradicate poverty. Poverty still existed, inequality still existed, regardless of that, nevertheless, very important religious or economic or financial mechanism. What is another difference that maybe can be taken into account when we discuss how the treatment of zakat differs between the modern and pre-modern or classical and contemporary period and scholarship about it, is that most probably the classical scholars thought of zakat first and foremost as a religious pillar, meaning that it's not only something that it's regarded through material context, but first and foremost spiritual, moral, or ethical, right? And these are obviously very, very heavy, very loaded terms. On one hand, very distinct, but also intertwined, right? Meaning being that in the classical period, if zakat is taught through spiritual lens, then it's something that really has to come from within, even though it is regarded as a religious practice or a pillar, right? This obviously treatment of zakat changes over time, especially with the birth of a contemporary field of Islamic finance and economics, which is really in the second half of 20th century, and then with Islamic banking, have its more very lucrative subfield, where zakat is being treated as legal, technical, and not only religious, practical aspect, right? So this means that then zakat is being treated as how to institutionalize it, how can it be incorporated, either to replace possibly income tax or to be added to one's income tax as well. And again, these are very, very different, I would say, terrain of not only what is the epistemological value of zakat, how it changes over time, but also in practical terms, what do we expect zakat to really do, right? And just before I finish up on that, to go back to its really etymology, it comes from zakaya, right? Zakat comes from the root of zakaya, which means essentially to purify one's wealth, right? And by purifying one's wealth, it also means that you purify one's soul or oneself. The sum game sort of zakat is then to cleanse your worldly wealth and to possibly attain some type of sort of spiritual awareness for not only for this world but also for the afterlife.
Well, thank you very much for this very rich discussion and explanation of epistemological and etymological considerations. Let's now talk about their implications in the later development of the Islamic economic thought or the Islamic moral philosophy, and specifically about the so-called classical Sufi literature. So purification seems to be a very Sufi idea, a kind of personal growth, if we use today's vocabulary. So how was the concept of zakat interpreted and developed within this classical Sufi scholarship?
Yeah, so this is very well, I think the whole excuse me, the institution of zakat really comes to life in the sense that in addition to the religious literature of the Quran and Hadith, which stipulates maybe the beginnings of how zakat should be treated, how zakat should be given, but really the theoretical discussions, they come after these religious sources, right? They come through not only through the works of legal scholars, Abu Yusuf, al-Shaybani, and other scholars as well, but also Sufi scholars. Now, I think it's worth mentioning that it's sometimes difficult to position one particular scholar within a particular specific field, which what we tend to do again from our contemporary perspective, as in, you know, for instance, al-Shaybani was only that particular scholar and did not reach out into other domains. We might think of al-Ghazali the same. And this is sort of just a general note that these scholars were, in various aspects, really polymaths, right? They navigated quite deftly different fields of study, different domains of research as well. And I think this points out that many legal scholars, as a matter of fact, including al-Shaybani, they discussed in length, for instance, kasb, the acquisition of wealth, right? The acquisition of making money or earning a livelihood, but also zuhd, on the other hand, so renouncing the world, right? Usually we would associate these particular concepts to be only applied within tasawwuf, within Sufism, right? And again, this points to the intertwinement of various disciplines, namely, obviously, ilm al-kalam, right? Theology or systematic theology, which is somewhat awkwardly translated into English, philosophy or falsafa, but also fiqh, substantive law in Islam, as well as Sufi conceptualizations from tasawwuf, right? So really the bulk of the literature comes in the 8th, 9th, 10th, and then beyond 11th century, right? And even further on, meaning that various scholars, many of them being trained as legal scholars as well, not only al-Shaybani, but also notably Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who is often regarded as a theologian, a philosopher, and a Sufi, discuss various aspects of zakah within their own respective boundaries and works.
Well, now a personal question. So you worked extensively on the scholarship of Al-Ghazali, and you seem to really know him very well. So what is his impact on you as a person and as a scholar? How has your study of Al-Ghazali's intellectual heritage and concepts informed your own understanding of economic practices or thought, or maybe your own life?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Alisa. I think, well, first, what really brought me to Al-Ghazali was, on my BA, on my undergraduate level, I studied double major sociology of knowledge and comparative literature and literary theory. And through my study of not only sort of literary texts, but also sociological, economic aspects within sociology of knowledge, and then switching to Islamic studies and Middle East studies, in my further undergraduate, but then later for my graduate studies as well, this is how I came to discover Al-Ghazali, as a matter of fact. So what drew me to Al-Ghazali is both my interest in Islamic thought and practice from a intellectual, historical, philosophical point of view, so to speak, but also the economic, financial, basically economic and financial questions that I concern myself with in my previous studies. And I found that the works, for instance, of Al-Ghazali really addresses multiple aspects when it comes to what we call now, the economic realm, for instance. And he is one that it's not only regarded as the Hujjat al-Islam, so the proof of Islam, because of his immense importance and contribution to various fields, from law to philosophy to theology to Sufism. It's a figure that it's sort of um, almost impossible to bypass if you study Islamic intellectual tradition, both because of quantity but also because of quality, I would say, of his works. But also because of his approach to what I call the economic thought or economic thinking in the context of several of his works, most notably The Revival of Religious Studies, Ihya Ulumuddin, Nasihat al-Muluk, The Council for Kings, but also Mizan al-Amal, right, which is a more, first and foremost, a book on really ethics, right? So his treatment then of economic thought is part and parcel of not only religious context, how one must be a religious, how one becomes a religious person, but it's more along the lines of ethical, even metaphysical questions that concern both the here, the dunya, and the hereafter, right, the akhirah. And this was to me very sort of appealing within al-Ghazali's thought. On one hand, he has a very detailed, systematic, structural discussion of what constitutes economic thought, right? How one engages with kasb and acquisition of wealth, in what context, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, there is nothing within praxis, right? And by praxis, I mean informed practice. So on one hand, you need ilm, you need knowledge, right? But then Al-Ghazali says, for instance, that knowledge without praxis is futile. It's useless, right? So this is, I think, where really economic, financial concerns and matters, they come to the forefront, in the sense that what you do with economic stipulations and even theories makes sense is only if you put them into practice. And that, again, has potential impact on what we really love to, refer to in the contemporary period and even in contemporary academia, what has the societal values, right? The possible impact on society today. So I think that there's a great value of rediscovering, rethinking, and possibly reapplying scholarship from the classical period. And that very much includes Al-Ghazali as well.
Oh, thank you, Sami. You also talk about the notion of accountability or self-accountability in your research, and you situate ZAKAT within an Islamic epistemology of self-accountability. How does this framework differ from contemporary neoliberal conceptions of accountability and personal responsibility?
Yeah, that's a good point. So and this is mostly maybe discussed in my recent the edited volume, but also specifically in the article on Tazkiyah and Zakatul Nafs, right? And I guess this points to the fact that I try to think of these concepts as interrelated, right? That when we talk about, let's say, specifically zakat, it really, if it means the purification of the self, right? And in the same breath, it means also purification of one's wealth, which again means that the material and the non-material are conceptualized together, right? You cannot purify your wealth without really purifying yourself in this context, or in the context of this scholarship. So when it comes to the notion of then accountability, which I try to connect it to tazkiyah as purification, right? To purify again your deeds, your actions, in order to attain a higher spiritual truths, basically. I try to conceptualize it or theorize it as a very comprehensive accountability. That what you give not only to yourself, but also to society. So again, it does not point only to the religious aspect of oneself, right? That would be, I think, very, very, well, not only normative, but also very limiting. What these scholars, and I think Al-Ghazali as well, think when they, when they refer to, let's say, tazkiyah in their works, is really a overarching, all-encompassing accountability that has to do not only with you achieving, the possible higher ends of the afterlife, but the here and now, right? What is your contribution to society? And one way that you can really contribute to society is by being actively engaged in economic and financial and legal matters as well. This is again where muamalat, so transactional matters, so to speak, really go hand in hand with ibadat, matters of worship again. In this not necessarily normative, but ethical perspective, ethical or even spiritual perspective or context. So with the accountability, if there is any difference between our modern version or even neoliberal version of responsibility and the accountability in the context of tazkiyah, I think definitely there is both epistemological but also etymological, right? Etymological, as already pointed, is a full-fledged purification of both the material and non-material means. And when it comes to epistemology, in the sense that the contemporary neoliberal discussion or concept of responsibility really points to the market first and foremost, right? Market as a entity of sorts that breeds and lives on its own, and then how we can be responsible in purely economic terms, but really for the sake of the market and market transactions. This is not what the classical scholars had in mind, right, when they discussed the notion of tazkiyah. It's again, on one hand, is the material side of things, but on the other hand, in the same breath, is the non-material, which pertains again not only to the self and one's soul, but also if you think about the production processes as well. So the means of acquiring production processes in very sort of Marxist terms, I think are in essence spiritual in the context of these select classical scholars. So the distinction is both etymological, but also very importantly epistemological, I think.
Well, as long as we are talking about the means of production, I think I have to ask this question about Islam and Marxism. In the 20th century, some scholars noted certain parallels between Islam and Marxism, particularly in their shared concern for social justice and egalitarianism. And it was zakat, which was often cited as the most commonest practice in Islam. How would you characterize the epistemological commonalities and differences between Islam and Marxism in this regard, concerning zakat in particular and more broadly in general?
Yeah. So the more obvious differences are that in the case of Islam or in the context of classical scholarship, we're talking about the religious context, nevertheless, right? Whereby, let's say, the Quran or other sources would be a religious sources or religious documents, right? Within other economic traditions, obviously it's non-religious secular sources that really indicate what type of economic or financial practice you're engaging with, right? So that's one very obvious difference. Nevertheless, I think there are also some similarities, as you pointed out, when it comes to the distribution of wealth, when it comes to being attuned to social economic injustice that happens in our societies. So I think, as a matter of fact, that there might be a great deal of overlap when it comes to thinking across different boundaries, religious or even secular boundaries, specifically to economic and financial practices, right? Zakat might be one of them. But again, the issue, if you will, with zakat is that it has never been, as I previously mentioned, institutionalized to that level that would either eradicate poverty in society, whether in a Muslim majority country or not, and then two, it has never been, in addition to other quote-unquote Islamic financial mechanisms or tools, it has never been implemented to the level of really challenging the prevalent neoliberal global capitalism, right? So that, I think, has to be taken into account. And this is obviously, I'm pointing to a subtle or perhaps not so subtle critique of contemporary Islamic economic and financial project as well, right? But nevertheless, when it comes to similarities, are really between scholars that I think resort to both the Islamic tradition and the Marxist tradition, from Ali Shariati in the modern period to other scholars as well in 20th century. I believe that what they had in mind is really to think constructively along the lines of sort of not only reviving the Islamic tradition, but also thinking along the how to eradicate injustice, social inequalities, or financial inequalities that are pervasive in our societies. So these comparisons are not something new, right? They have been going on at least since the 70s, or even beyond that period, and I think they will keep on coming back in a reshaped form, right? The question is, what exactly can we achieve if we compare different both ideological systems? And this is where I think the critiques come in, saying that, how can a scholar engage with a coming from an Islamic tradition? How can he or she, for instance, engages with the with the non-religious tradition, right? Because it's Marxism does not, does not believe in a metaphysical truth in the same way as Islam does, for instance. To me, this might be a secondary question if we purely focus on the financial or economic or societal inequalities, right? If there is something that can be tackled through various means and concepts and mechanisms that can be possibly integrated from different ideological traditions, by not compromising the baseline of that which is an Islamic faith tradition, I don't see that this might be a problem for a particular scholarship. So I would welcome types of research and perspectives that really build on the comparative aspects.
I have recently come across some new studies on how the Marxist thought is embedded in Christian epistemology. And this research actually fueled my interest in the commonalities and differences between Islam and Marxism. So I looked into this Islamic economic theist socialist thought a little bit. And what struck me is that it really approaches the biggest Marxist paradox, which is our dependence on the material world. And this is kind of the basis of Marxist dialectics. It is the source of all the evils, but it is also our source of existence, material existence.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the classical Islamic scholarship and the Sufi thought offers this idea of moral economy based on the renunciation to the corporeal desire in a way. But what I discovered that in the 20th century, this creation of a Islamic body politics, which was envisioned within the model of the Islamic State and what we refer to as Islamist thought. Here, Sufi ethics of moral consumption becomes more of an exclusionary mechanism, both politically, so it impedes the development of democracies because only the pure, only those who can tame their corporeal desire should be given the privilege of decision-making in Islamic societies. But also on the gender level, so women who are supposed to be more prone to desire find themselves excluded from the political process. So what do you think about these possibilities of emancipation, which the Sufi moral economy offers, but also the dangers of social exclusion? And here I would cite the example of al-Shariati, whose thought was to a certain extent built on Aimé Césaire's contribution to post-colonial thought, but it also differed from it in a very significant way because Shariati was saying that Maulana, the perfect Sufi, is the model you should emulate. Whereas Aimé Césaire was saying, listen to your body. Your body tells you the truth. So do you think that these two sides of the Sufi moral economic thought can be reconciled in the contemporary political context where the question of economic inequality is really kind of connected to that of class struggle and our physical needs?
Yeah, this is quite. I think this is a challenging question in the sense that I see some issues, obviously, with the classical scholarship itself and particular scholars as well. That includes Al-Ghazali, right? It's not that I would, let's say, blindly agree with everything that Al-Ghazali said or did. I think we have to be objective in our analysis and approach to any religious tradition or even philosophical tradition for that matter, right? That includes very much Al-Ghazali. One of the criticism is that often Al-Ghazali wrote for the elite, and I think he mentions that quite clearly in one of his texts as well, right? So not everything that he wrote or quote unquote published was meant for the Amma, the common folk, the common people, right? It was meant for the quote unquote the spiritual elite as well, which would then automatically exclude a lot of people, right? We have to take this into account. Second is also the gender aspect, right? Were classical scholars, Al-Ghazali included, really cognizant of thinking not only of men, but also of women as active participants in these social contracts or socioeconomic, financial, legal contracts as well, right? So these questions are very important, I think, to ask and also to then analyze their work accordingly. On the other hand, what I've learned sort of from the classical scholarship or classical Sufi scholarship, even though I do not focus on Sufism per se, right? I'm more interested in intellectual history within Islamic thought. And many of these scholars were also Sufis, right? Even though they might be trained as legal scholars. For instance, Al-Ghazali himself was trained by Al-Juwayni. What that taught me, though, is that we often think, I think erroneously, of Sufism, at least in the classical, 8th, 9th, 10th century period, of being completely detached from the world. And there definitely was a strand within Sufi thought that did exactly that, try to get as far away from society as possible. But I don't think that at least the scholars that I was dealing with were thinking along these lines. And second, I don't think that they perceive that to be the norm of Sufi practice itself. What that then means is basically that they thought of Sufism, on the other hand, that it's something that must be included in society. That as an active and devoted Sufi, one has to be part and parcel of the society in which he lives. One has to then, as a consequence of that, he has to engage with the financial transactions, commercial activity, buying, selling, and so on and so forth. So you have to be, quote unquote, an active member of society in which you live, right? I think that very much goes even for Al-Ghazali, who, as we all know, left his prominent position in the Nizamiya madrasa in Baghdad, and then left for 10 years to wander around and engage in different texts and spiritual practice. But nevertheless, he comes back, right? So he himself maybe is a proof that, a wandering Sufi is only one side of his identity, so to speak. So the most important part is that he comes back. He engages with both education, students, but also being in conversation with other political figures and leaders and so forth, right? So now, if we think of economic activity itself, very broadly sort of defined or conceived, not in this contemporary neoliberal terms, it's something that it's technical or at most legal in nature, but first and foremost, really humanistic, ethical in nature, that at the end of the day, any economic activity deals with human beings, first and foremost, right? Then if we sort of zoom out a little bit and think critically of the modern field of economics, this brings us to the early modern Europe and the division of sciences between natural sciences and social sciences, and then eventually humanities as well, right? How this division of sciences was treated and conceptualized, within what context, and towards what end, right? So economics as a self-standing science, it's pretty new, it's pretty modern. Often we refer to Adam Smith as the father of modern economic science, and we can come back to that possibly later on. But this is to say that a lot of the roots of economic thought and thinking and sciences they originate from philosophical, ethical, and moral thinking, right? And philosophers themselves. So I think this is something that maybe economists do not delve into. They're not interested in that as well. And then we end up with, mathematical deductivism, dealing with obviously statistics and numbers, and eventually we call that field economic science, right? So we have to question the origins of a particular discipline, the division of sciences, and how does that feed into this neoliberal machine that we're all part of today. So by reverting to the classical pre-modern scholarship, I think there's a great deal for us to learn from that tradition, whether from a purely quote unquote religious perspective or not. My interest is first and foremost through intellectual history, not necessarily religion as such, right? That brings then into question further how we treat economics as a human science, or how should we treat economics as a human science. And then that the market of today is very different from what the market of the 7th or 9th or 10th century Andalusia or Baghdad meant in this quote unquote Islamic terms, or what the Arabic notion of souk really denounces, right? So I think there is a great deal for us to learn from the classical tradition. We can, I think, easily incorporate it, at least when it comes to offering texts and reading material as part and parcel of our curricula. And then, this can actually spiral out that we think of different centers and NGOs and beyond. So not only educational institutions that could very much engage with text to begin with. So classical text on that particular notion. This might have actually ramifications for how we think of Islamic economics as a field, right? Which again, in modern terms, is not really concerned with the pre-modern classical scholarship, right? But this is exactly one focal point of my research. Going back into the pre-modern, trying to incorporate some of their thoughts, some of their sort of thinking, and reanalyze that within the modern context. What exactly does that mean? What kind of impact it might have for our modern lives as well?
Well, it is amazing that you mentioned the market, the pre-modern market of the Abbasid Empire, because from my incorrect understanding of morality, poverty was a necessary component of a pious lifestyle. But apparently, this is not exactly the case with this classical Sufi scholarship. So, poverty is a big thing in the Sufi practice. It is embodied in the figures of the faqr or dervish, who are the synonyms of Sufi. And it is a kind of widely recognized path of spiritual self-renunciation. But what do the classical Sufi thinkers say about poverty in a broader societal framework? What implications poverty has for an entire society, not just a Sufi scholar?
Yeah, so poverty as faqr in Arabic, right? I think goes very well with another important concepts for us, which would be mal or wealth or money, more specifically, right? So faqr and mal are often conceptualized, I would say, together in many of these texts as well, which again points to sort of a dual character of these terms and concepts, right? So if we start with faqr as poverty, we can divide it into possibly into material poverty and spiritual poverty, right? And someone like Al-Ghazali would say that, and other scholars as well, or Sufis, that poverty is a necessary element of Sufi thought and practice, right? There's no such thing as attaining really the highest levels of Sufism or Tasawwuf without engaging in some specific element of faqr or poverty. However, here I think maybe the misconception arises then. Some trends within Sufism would say that engaging in material poverty is equally important as engaging with spiritual poverty, in the sense that you have to renounce the world, you have to practice zuhd, right? You have to reject the material aspects of this life. That is very much the case. I'm just not convinced that this would be the majority of scholarship pointing to that type of application of faqr, right? On the other hand, when Al-Ghazali says, for instance, that poverty does not mean if you have that which is sufficient, right? So having sufficient meaning that you have enough, to sustain yourself, right? By that, you're still not poor. You have enough, so to speak, to sustain yourself. Enough meaning food, water, clothing, and possibly a roof over your head, right? So the bare minimum is definitely secured. On the other hand, the spiritual poverty is something that really has to do with the Sufi stations of achieving some type of devotional praxis, which again is based on obtained knowledge, right? Knowledge is either obtained or revealed. Ilm is knowledge that you can obtain to different sciences. On the other hand, ma'rifah is a revealed knowledge. It's something that it's sort of given as well, right? So both of these are obviously important, but I wouldn't say that the majority of Sufis would think of poverty in purely material terms, right? Now, how does that connect or not to mal or wealth or money? Well, in various ways. Al-Ghazali stated that in Ihya, in Revival of Religious Sciences, that التاجر الصدوق أفضل عند الله من المثبت, meaning the merchant, honest merchant, is superior in the eyes of God to the servant, right? This is how sort of important engaging with commercial life was for Al-Ghazali, again, as one of the most important scholars in Islamic history. Mal then, for Al-Ghazali, is theorized, again, in this dual sense, that it can either provide um, livelihood for someone, right? So you can engage with sustaining yourself, and that extends to maybe your family and your community, or to achieve other higher ends or goals, right? So it's a medium of exchange. Wealth or money, it's a medium of exchange. Sort of instead of a barter exchange, you use money, dirhams or dinars, to gain something else, a different type of commodity or goods, or to achieve higher ends, right? Meaning it's never an end in and of itself, right? You cannot make money to create more money. That would be, in the eyes of Al-Ghazali, an illicit commercial practice or financial practice, right? So money has to be put into circulation, absolutely, but it has to be put in circulation in order to provide for the well-being, either for yourself, for your family, or for the community in which you live, right? So that, I think, is important to take into account, because a lot of scholars from Al-Shaybani to Al-Ghazali, even Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Khaldun, they discuss the concept of money in various terms, but more often than not, they would agree, I think, that money is a medium of exchange. It can never be theorized or conceptualized as as on its own terms, so to speak. And this then brings into conversation what is the end goal of economic practice or commerce as well, right? That definitely there is this material, technical aspect to it, but it's only one aspect within the whole, kaleidoscope or mosaic of that which we call economic thought, which is much more, I think, spiritual in essence than material.
So, beyond zakat, what are other instruments or principles within Islamic thought which guide the establishment of a righteous or ethically sound economic conduct?
Yeah, so in addition to zakat as a alms giving, there is absolutely sadaqah is charity, but again, is, I think, less important or less maybe practiced possibly than zakat as a pillar. There is the tool or concept of riba, or usury or excessive usury, depending how one would define it and translate it. And here again, Islamic scholarship differs. What exactly constitutes riba? You have two types of riba, right? So options of occurring usury, either when the quantity of a good is incorrectly assessed and you're dealing with two different types of goods. For instance, I don't know, you're treating barley for dates, right? So there is a different weight to it, right? Or that riba can occur not necessarily in quantity, but in terms of time delivery. Time, obviously, from modern economics as well, is very important. When you buy something or when you sell something, depending how the markets are doing, depending how the stocks are doing today, time is of crucial importance for a particular value to be either high or low, right? So riba, classical scholars even pointed out, can occur when you have a um, different time being applied to a particular transaction, commercial transaction, right? So there is zakah, there is sadaqah, there is riba. There are other tools as well that we could think of. But again, all these are not to be treated only as within the technical legal aspect. I think, as we saw, kasb as well, right? The acquisition of wealth, earning a livelihood. But again, kasb and zuhd, on the other hand, have been theorized in Kitab al-Kasb al-Shaybani, al-Muhasibi's text, Ibn Abil Dunya's text, al-Ghazali's, al-Isfahani's, and beyond, right? So again, it's the dual character of material or economic or financial transactions that are really theorized along the lines of, well, on one hand, you have to earn something, but on the other hand, you have to engage in some type of renouncing the world, right? So at the end of the day, all has to do with purification. All these types of transactions, I think, have to do with purifying oneself, right? There's no moving beyond that, right? If you engage only with the financial aspect, I think that's one-sided perception of what commerce would be all about, right? And I think this brings us back to the very notion of, but what is the market then? What was souk in classical Islamic scholarship, and how different it is from treating the market today as, rational choice theory, individualism, and hedonism, right? I think it's on the opposite end of that.
Well, it's funny what you said about barley and dates really made me think about Marx's dialogue between the shoe and the coat, who think that they are the same thing just because they have the same market value. So there is also this kind of a reflection on the language we use, the language of economics. But again, the big problem which Islamic scholars cited as an obstacle of staying a good Muslim and being Marxist at the same time is the matter of existence. Nature versus culture in a certain way. So what about nature? What does the classical Islamic scholarship say about nature? Well, I know that Sufi literature often emphasizes harmonious relations with nature. And for example, Ibn Tufail's story is often evoked as a Muslim Robinson Crusoe story. And so there is a kind of man who lives in harmony with animals and plants and does not kind of enslave another person living on this island. So how do Sufi thinkers conceptualize the human relationship with nature, especially compared to the resource-centered view common in mainstream economics today?
Yeah, so I think that at least in my work, I try to think of that which we called economics and that which we called environment, right, as mutually intertwined concepts, right? And I think this can be found not only in Islamic tradition, but also in other traditions, including in ancient Greece, right? I mean, economy and ecology, they derive from oikos, right? Oikos is sort of denoting a fireplace or a fire pit or the heart of a household, right? That obviously changes over time, but nevertheless, etymologically speaking, economy and ecology, they derive from the same root. And I think something similar happened in the classical Islamic tradition as well, whereby that which we refer to as economics, right? So the economic, financial transactions, commercial life, and so forth. If you think in this cosmological or metaphysical context, is very much part and parcel of our lived environment, right? Economy is even today part of environment and environmental ethics, so to speak. So it's very difficult to discern or to detach the economic from the environmental, coming from that sort of perspective, right? This is not obviously the case today, whereby we treat different fields of study very separately, but also we think of economics as a self-standing science, market as something that they live on their own, they have their own existence, so to speak. And then on the other hand, we think of climate change, global climate change, or environment, or nature is something that is sort of out there at our service, at our disposal, right? Classical scholarship, I think, teaches us that these entities are intertwined and interconnected, That I think very much includes to Hayy bin Yaqdan, and Ibn Tufail's sort of philosophical novel. And other scholars as well, from Al-Biruni, who, we might think of Al-Biruni as a scientist, really, astrologer, who were thinking about nature and natural phenomena as in a very cosmological sense, so that these natural elements are first and foremost connected, right? Nature is not something that lives there on its own. It's part of the divine creation, first and foremost. And then we, as human beings, are very much part of the lived environment, right? There is no humanity without the lived environment, right? Furthermore, I think Ibn Tufail's novel teaches us also that there is no waste in nature, which points to the economy of environment, right? On the other hand, human beings, we produce waste in society. Quite often, in modern terms, also very dangerous waste, so to speak, in terms of sort of industrial production and so forth, right? So economy and ecology are intertwined, etymologically speaking or epistemologically speaking, and I think they have to be then theorized along the same lines, in the sense that how does that impact the study of economics and environmental studies or environmental humanities today? What can we learn again from the classical tradition, either Islamic or any other? And then furthermore, and this is really where my sort of more recent interest lies, in decoloniality, right? I think that looking through other non-European sources when it comes to economic or environmental thought really brings into question decoloniality, of how to reconceptualize these very, very important terms, but thinking critically about their methodology, epistemology, the origins of knowledge, how we agree and then determine of what is applicable and what is not applicable, either within classrooms when it comes to delivering knowledge, but also in our broader societies, right, and in financial institutions. So decoloniality simply would mean, to put it in a very simple terms, even though we live in post-colonial world when it comes to military, political, legal engagements or connectivities, the remnants of colonialism are still here, right? They're still very much present in our day-to-day life, in the way we teach certain subjects, in the way we use particular languages, in the way we brush over particular traditions. And this very much pertain also to Islamic intellectual tradition.
Well, this is so interesting because it echoes Ulrika Mortensen's new research on lawmaking in Egypt, and this issue of internal Orientalism and the tyranny of modernity comes up in the 1950s when the land reform is enacted. So the Islamic law is considered to be only applicable to land law and the use of land. So what is industry and all kinds of modern technology is not something which should be approached through the lens of Sharia. And I think it is connected to environmental Orientalism and that the question of decoloniality that you just evoked. You mentioned that Adam Smith's economic thought is closer to al-Ghazali than to today's neoliberal economic theory. So do you see value in exploring counterfactual approaches, considering alternative evolutionary paths for economic theory inspired by classical Islamic concepts? For example, what could economics be like if there was no colonialism?
Mm. Yeah, I think this relates to somewhat to the previous questions that we just discussed, in the sense that if we are serious about critiquing the modern division of sciences and thinking of modernity as being very much connected to colonialism. I mean, we know from other scholarship, that not only Islamic scholarship, that there is no modernity without colonialism and vice versa, right? Then I think one way of remedying that, the modern world in which we sort of live in, with all its beauty but also all its problems, is to not necessarily reinvent, but rethink and reconceptualize different theories, approaches, paths, perspectives, methods, and epistemologies that have been casted either as unimportant or unscientific. This again brings into the question this academic bias of between the emic and the ethic. And who are we as, first and foremost, as scholars or as academics? Who has the upper hand in deciding what type of knowledge is applicable in classrooms? And based on whose research as well, right? And this is to say that even though parts of my research deal with scholarship and scholars that are obviously and understandably in the classical period engage with normative questions, the end goal of my scholarship is absolutely not normative, right? And I think this is very much important to emphasize, because for us in Islamic or Middle East studies, we've often charged with, well, but what you guys doing is basically faith, tradition, theology, and whatnot. And for the most part, this is not the case, right? You can have a scientific, historical study analysis of particular tradition, whether faith or not, or particular ideology as well. Second, it really ties into this the very notion of decoloniality. I think if we're serious to engage with economic and environmental traditions, the only path forward, from my perspective, is through the notion of decoloniality, because it brings to the forefront other perspectives that have not been really taken seriously, or they've been casted as unscientific or ethical, and therefore unworthy of treatment, right? Part of it maybe can be done through environmental humanities, which is a relatively recent field, even though, and when I say, in part, why? Because it has incorporated philosophical, feminist, other social perspectives, literary theory, and so on and so forth. But part of the issue of environmental humanities has been that it's been also, at least in some aspects, Eurocentric. So again, we have to bring this into conversation if we're really, serious about delivering a well-rounded critique of our division of knowledge as well. When it comes to more specifically Adam Smith, for instance, again, he was trained as a moral philosopher, right? Which means that the origins of economic thinking are philosophical in nature, right? And the origins of economic thought in Islamic tradition are also ethical in nature. So that is important to note. The modern economists obviously claim Adam Smith to be the father figure of modern economics. I think this would be somewhat incorrect, because there are competitive narratives of who Adam Smith was, right, and what he tried to achieve. We always point to the so-called invisible hand, which he famously sort of formalized in his text, and The Wealth of a Nation, and the moral sentiments, and so forth. But again, these are two different texts, the moral sentiments and the Wealth of Nation, right? And these two texts can be very much read together as well, in tandem, which again points to the fact that Adam Smith was concerned with ethical questions and inequality and social inequality, economic inequality, and so forth, right? Even though he was reluctant to agree that government should be interfering in economic oversight or financial oversights, right? So one way of remedying that is going back to the philosophical foundations of economic thought, and trying to introduce that actually to economists. Now, whether economists might agree with us or not is obviously a different question altogether. But I think we have to be brave enough, I would say, to try to think outside of the confinements of what exactly constitutes, economic and environmental thought from, again, Eurocentric modern perspectives, right? And that brings into question all sorts of theories, all sorts of approaches that even go beyond the Islamic tradition, right? So I think this is where part of my interest lies as well.
Well, thank you so much, Sami, for your precious insights. It was a very thought-provoking talk, and I wish we could talk more about it, but time is running out. So please find the links to the relevant literature in the description of the episode, and stay tuned.